Pope Paul VI, who was Pope in the 60s and 70s, once greeted a conference of scholars of St. Augustine in Rome, and he said to them, what are you here for? And they said, to study St. Augustine. And Pope Paul said, how do you study an ocean? It's a very, very insightful way of thinking about the study of St. Augustine. How do you study an ocean? So I don't know everything there is to know about St. Augustine. I know what I've studied. I know what I've run into in 40 years of working with Augustine's texts. I don't think there is one world expert on St. Augustine. I think there are experts in different fields of Augustine, right? And I likened the difference between Augustine and Aquinas as the difference between the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. I won't say which is which, but they're both huge enterprises. And I actually don't know a scholar in any recent times who has been able to do both competently. That's how different. There are similarities, but that's how different they are. Anyway, that's all I have to say about Aquinas. That's all I'm going to mention about it. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. And I'll try to be as clear as John says I am. And afterwards, maybe we can take some questions or discussion along the lines of what I'm talking about, please. I don't want to go into other aspects of Augustine's thought either this morning, because I've prepared this talk, this text, these ideas, and nothing else for this morning. So please try not to drag me into other areas of Augustinian thought. If you do, I'll try to answer, but it'll be totally incomplete and not very good. All right, so John gave you some sheets which I did not prepare, and I haven't even really looked at. They come from the beginning of a booklet which I just wrote last summer called Spiritual Discernment in the Thought of Augustine, or St. Augustine, I forget. I think that booklet has been posted entirely on your website.
Yeah. Is that what you sent me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So
It has.
to see the entire text, you can go to your website and read it there. All right. So I'll read some passages. I know people don't like to be read at, and I appreciate that. But just to guide my thought for the next hour, I'll read a passage, then I'll break away and comment on it, and maybe in some point in the talk, I'll just throw the whole thing out and just talk, which would be delightful. But anyway, to get me started, like a plane taking off on a runway, I will read some of the beginning of this paper that I've written. I should say, too, the booklet that I wrote, Spiritual Discernment of the Thought of Augustine, I wrote it for college-age men, not women, men who are thinking about the Catholic priesthood, looking at it, and we're saying discerning it, trying to find out whether that is a vocation they want to pursue or not. And the question that was put to me by my colleagues was, explaining to them the art of discernment according to the thought of St. Augustine. Now, these young men are not necessarily preparing to join my religious order, and they may not join any religious order. They may join a diocese, but in some way or other, I wrote it for guys who are thinking about priesthood. I do think, and so do those who have read the booklet, that it has applications way beyond that narrow scope. But I will say that was my intention in writing it. And there are three areas that I developed in the entirety of the booklet: prayer, friendship, and self-knowledge. Prayer, friendship, and self-knowledge. For me, these three pillars are the keys to Augustine's spirituality, or search for God. How do we search for God And how do we come to know what we should do, our vocation, if you will, in response to that search for God? So the three essential elements, I argue, are prayer, friendship, and self-knowledge. And I maintain, I'm already stepping away from the paper, I maintain that the way to think about prayer, friendship, and self-knowledge in Augustine, not necessarily in other writers or thinkers, but in Augustine, is to think of them as intertwining activities or realities. Intertwining. And I likened this to a gemstone. Now, I'm not a gemnologist or whatever they are. But my idea of a gem is that when you hold it up to the light and you turn it, you see different facets. The facets differ one from another, but they all are part of one gem. That's how I think discernment works for Augustine. Prayer, friendship, and self-knowledge cannot be separated one from another in the thought of Augustine. Once you separate prayer from friendship and self-knowledge, you're not doing Augustinian spirituality anymore. Maybe it's Carmelite or Carthusian or Trappist or Benedictine or Dominican, but it is not Augustinian. There are different spiritualities in the Catholic Church as well as outside of the Catholic Church. There are Eastern Orthodox spiritualities. There are Protestant spiritualities. John Wesley, Methodist, famous for a kind of approach to God. So in my approach to Augustine's thought, I see these as intertwined kind of realities, and I'll explain what I mean. How do I go about getting to know and love God? To understand and accept what he wants me to do with my life. To understand discernment as Augustine does, we must look closely at three aspects of our lives: prayer, friendship, and self-knowledge. For Augustine, these are not entirely distinct, isolated activities in our lives. They act together in harmony with each other. We don't pray for a while, then go out and spend some time with friends and talk to them, and then enter into some kind of self-reflection. Of course we do. There are times for prayer, there's times to be with our friends, and there's time to reflect on ourselves, of course. But in discernment, those three aspects, those three elements are fused together and inseparable. So I can't know what God wants me to do simply by praying. I can't know what God wants me to do simply by talking to my friends. And for friends, I could include family too, but I'm focused on friendship because Augustine is. And I cannot attain some kind of self-knowledge without prayer and my friends. Now, isn't that interesting? I can't know myself in isolation from my friends or from prayer. Augustine does not downplay, the idea that we should love God above everything, search for God, does not downplay the importance of loving one's friends. In fact, in his Confessions, he makes it clear that he would not have arrived at the proper love of God and acceptance of his vocation without the help of his many friends. In understanding what Augustine means when he prays to desire nothing else but God and to cleave to nothing else by God, we need to keep in mind that for him, and this is important, and this does not apply exclusively to Augustine's thought, God is not a being that stands in relation to other beings. This is hard. You think you understand it. So when we think about love of other people, a wife, a husband, a child, a friend, we sometimes slip into thinking, is that love for my friend, is that in disharmony with my love for God? And that's where we break down. As soon as we think of that, we break down. We're not anymore thinking about God as God. For Augustine, God is love itself. In understanding what Augustine means when he prays to desire nothing else but God, and to cleave to nothing else but God, and that prayer is on the sheets that John Cummins gave you, we need to keep in mind that for him, God is not a being in relation to other beings. So we do not choose between loving a friend or loving God. God is love itself. So God is not a rival to our friends. Okay? All right. It is an important point, so I'm happy to repeat it. When we hear it said that we shouldn't love another person more than God, and we do hear this said, what it means is that our love for the other should be pure, not selfish. That's all. Pure, not selfish. This means that our love for others should be aimed at promoting their true good, which is God. This is another subtle but very important point. Our love for others should be aimed at promoting their true good, which is God, not something harmful. When our love for our friends is pure, we love them in God. This is an Augustinian axiom. When our love for the other is pure, we love them in God. And I'll clarify what he means by that. God is the very ground of our love for them, the reason we love them, and the end to which we love them. So we should desire God above all else. Let me try to explain that. I love another person, a friend. Let's use the friend. I love a friend. In loving my friend, am I loving him into loving God? Into loving God. I'm jumping ahead a bit, but that's okay. Into loving God. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let me tell you what I don't mean by that. From Augustine, I don't mean loving them into becoming a Catholic. It's not a proselytizing kind of love. I mean, Augustine hopes that people will become Catholic, of course. But what we love is the other's good, the other's moral and spiritual good. And that good may just be a step in the direction of God. That good may be more immediate. But if I love the good of another, I seek to promote the good of another. Notice I'm using the word good. The good of another. But when I love the good of another, what happens to the friend? This doesn't apply to everybody, of course, but the friend whose good I'm loving. So think of a mother and a child. The mother loves the good of the child. Well, let's not use baby. Let's use child with a little bit of rationality. The other person I love, the friend, the family member, whatever, will feel that goodness from me. They will have a feeling of being loved, of being cared for, of their good being promoted. They have that feeling. I have a similar feeling. When you do good for someone, you feel good. Now, I'm not talking about people that are psychotic or neurotic or whatever. I'm talking about normal, healthy people, if we can allow that, right? I feel good. The other person feels good. That's key to Augustine, okay? So there's a sharing in goodness. That goodness is an aspect of God. So when I love the good of another person, I am loving that person into loving God by drawing them to desire the good. Now, it may be the good in their own life, right? But if it's good, then it's spiritual for Augustine. It's moving that person. In other words, love is transcendent at that point. Transcendent. It transcends the other, and my love for that person is also my love of God. For Augustine, we love God through our love, our right love, our pure love for other people. Love of God and love of neighbor in Augustine. This has been studied by other scholars. Love of God and love of neighbor in Augustine are almost equal. Let me quote Augustine here. It is not a different love which loves the neighbor from the one which loves God. With the same love as we love our neighbor with, let us also love God. But because God is one thing, our neighbor another, they are loved with one love. And yet, they are not one thing being loved. Augustine said that in a sermon. This is not in one of his philosophical or theological treatises. He's saying this to his congregation at Mass. This is as clear and in a simplified kind of way as I can find this point in St. Augustine's writings. If I love the other, I love him or her into loving God. Another quote. We, of course, truly love our neighbors as ourselves. The commandment, love God, love your neighbor as yourself. We, of course, truly love our neighbors as ourselves if we bring them to the extent we can to a similar love of God. We therefore love God on account of himself and love ourselves and our neighbor on account of him. This is difficult to grasp. If you're finding it a little bit too abstract, you're in good company. That's what it is. The transcendent nature of love is not easy for us to understand in Augustinian terms. Could someone have done a better job of explaining this? Without doubt. And probably there are philosophers, theologians who have done a better job. But Augustine is one of the first who's actually pursuing this line of thought. He's a pioneer in this sense. So we got to cut him a break here, right? You've experienced this. You may not have reflected on it, but I dare say if you've loved somebody with a pure love, what is a pure love? A pure love is not a self-seeking love. Now, you'll all say, if you're good Augustinians, but Father, our love can't be pure. We're human beings. We're subjects of original sin. We will never love another person with an absolutely pure altruistic love. And that's right. Augustine says the same thing many, 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 many times. But he does believe we can asymptotically arrive at something that is a purer love than perhaps we loved at first. And he certainly thought that about himself. The Confessions is a kind of a journey of Augustine from a very self-centered love to a love that breaks through some of those barriers to a certain extent. Even Augustine himself would say, I'm not there. One of the texts that I quote, maybe in this paper, maybe in one is, I am an enigma to myself. Magnum mysterium mihi. I am a mystery to myself. So he can't know the ends, the telos, to which his love is really directed. Is it the absolute love of God mediated through the love of another human being, or does it fall short? He doesn't really claim to know. Now, so I said prayer, friendship, and self-knowledge. Prayer for Augustine is desire for God. And he has a lot of different things to say about prayer. But in terms of prayer and friendship, well, there's two ways of that working out, really. First of all, to his friends, he can confide about himself. Let me read another passage. I confess that I cast myself without reservation on the love of those who are especially close to me, particularly when worn out by the upsets of the world. In their love, I rest without the slightest worry because I perceive that God is present there. God is present in the friend. In this security, I am undisturbed by my fear of the uncertainty of tomorrow. For when I see that a person is aflame with Christian love and therefore has become a faithful friend to me, I know that whatever thoughts or considerations I entrust to him, I entrust to God, in whom that person dwells, and by whom he is who he is. So what do we see here? We see Augustine confiding himself to his friend. His friend isn't just any friend. It's a friend whom he says reflects Christian love back to him. And when he does this, he feels secure, because in confiding his troubles, his worries, his concern, his anxieties to that friend, he is confiding them to God. Prayer and friendship intertwined. Are there other forms of prayer? Absolutely. Augustine recommends going to church, listening to hymns, good hymns, not Catholic hymns, please. Not that garbage that we have to listen to every Sunday. Yeah, you would. Having thrown out that good music that the Anglicans have preserved. All right, I'll get off my hobby horse. But Augustine talks twice in the Confessions about the effect of church music on his soul, on his spirit. So that's another form of prayer, not involving friends or praying the Psalms. Augustine was really big on praying the Psalms, reading the scriptures and praying the Psalms, or hearing the Psalms prayed during Mass. He exalts the prayer Our Father, sees in it all the necessary components of every prayer. And he stresses, and I stress this in my paper because, again, I'm writing for young men who are considering priesthood, silence. Silence. Trying to put thoughts, worries, concerns, and worldly desires like my next meal out of our heads and being alone. Be still and know that I am God. So there are forms of prayer that don't involve friendship, certainly. But in discerning, I don't discern what God wants me to do without my friends. Now, this is, again, rather unique. Rather unique. The Desert Fathers will say, get an Abba, get a monk who's elderly and wise and can guide you. So it's not as though other spiritualities don't talk about the importance of other human beings in directing our search for God's will. No. But for Augustine, this is very deep. In this world, two things are essential, he writes: life and friendship. Two things are essential in this life: life itself and friendship. Both should be highly prized, and we must not undervalue them. God created us that we might exist and live. This is life. But if we are not to remain alone, there must be friendship. In another quote from the City of God, there is no greater consolation than the sincere loyalty and mutual affection of good and true friends. No greater consolation. These are bold statements about the importance of friendship. Friends should aim to lead each other to God. Simply put, this is what it means to love our friends in God. But how do we do this? Ask yourself how you care for your friends' spiritual lives. Do you ever speak to them about God? Are you the kind of friend they would open up to about religion, or would you be embarrassed and quickly change the subject? Remember, I'm writing this for college students, university students. Do you ever pray for them or with them? Loving a friend in God certainly doesn't mean talking about church or prayer all the time, but it does require that we do so as needed. Augustine recognizes that each of us is spiritually weak at times, and that no matter how mature we think we are, we can easily lose our way. On these occasions, we all need to rely on friends to steer us back to spiritual health, to care for our souls, and we also need to care for theirs. Quoting Augustine in the Confessions, if your delight is in others, love them in God, because they too are frail and gain stability only when grounded in Him. Otherwise, they would go their way and be lost. Love them then in Him, and draw as many with you to Him as you can. Tell them, He is the one we should love, for He is not far off. When we taste the truth, God is there. He is in our very inmost hearts. Stand with Him, and you will stand firm. Rest in Him, and you will find peace. Augustine did not shy away from offering spiritual advice to his friends, even when it was inconvenient. As a bishop, he had a close friend who was a powerful Roman governor. Augustine lived in the 5th century, and he lived in Roman Africa. When he urged the governor to pardon a condemned criminal, he didn't apologize for using strong language, because friends speak frankly with friends when their spiritual good is at stake. No one can be another's friend unless he has first been the friend of truth itself, Augustine wrote to him. This is to a Roman governor. And I continue the quote. I seem to say this with not enough respect. But I rightly fear to be displeasing first of all to God, and then to the friendship you have consented to enter into with me. When I speak with you on your own behalf, I am franker to the extent I am more your friend. On another occasion, a young man, a student, wrote to Augustine as bishop now, and asked him some advice about his career ambitions. Augustine had a worldly career before his baptism and before his decision to become a monk. Dioscorus, this young man, did not believe in God. He wanted, nevertheless, a friendship with the bishop, and Augustine wanted a friendship with him. But he urged him to focus on the pursuit of truth rather than popular appeal. Believe me, my Dioscorus, it is true. I pray that I may enjoy your friendship. Enjoy your friendship. In the desire for the truth, by whose shadow you are turned away. After all, you do not see truth, nor can you in any way see it, as long as you pile up fragile joys from the flattery of human beings. Again, tough love, right? So the role of friendship in discernment is to love our friends by persuading them, guiding them into finding and holding on to their deepest truth. Remember, Augustine talks to Dioscorus about truth. He talks to Macedonius, this governor, about truth. Truth is another name for God. If you love the good, the true good, you love God. If you love the truth, the true truth, the real truth, you love God. Again, this transcendental move in Augustine's thought. Augustine firmly believes that discernment, the search for God, is a shared search with friends. He knew from his own experience that we do not find truth alone. Amazing. So you can't just sit in your room or in church or in the monastery and meditate, isolating yourself from other human beings and find God. Again, not all Catholic spirituality would necessarily agree with this. Many monks and nuns lock themselves away. I'm not saying that's wrong. Augustine would. There are different pathways. There are different spiritualities. But his absolutely requires friendship. And I think that's both outstanding and quite unique. Two of Augustine's closest friends, housemates of his in Milan. Now, this is before his conversion to Christianity. Helped him to discern the greatest truth of his life, that he should become a Christian and change his career. His best friend was Alypius, a student of his, whom he called my heart's brother, this man so closely united with me. Another companion was Nebridius, a friend most tenderly loved, Augustine defines him, who had earlier persuaded Augustine to abandon his addiction to astrology, not astronomy, but astrology. It was Nebridius who convinced Augustine to let go of astrology. Now, at 29 years of age, Augustine was a professor in Milan with an important job in the emperor's court. But his professional and personal lives were a mess. His job was stressful, yet he was ambitious, yearned to become wealthy, and maneuvered among influential men to further his political career. At the same time, he dreamed of forming a community with his friends and devoting himself to the study of philosophy. Gradually, he grew more deeply attracted to Christianity, but at the same time, he struggled to understand and accept Catholic teaching. In this confused state of mind, he and his friends spoke openly with each other about their problems. I want to go back to this point, which is very complicated. Augustine is 29. He has a very important job at this time. It's a double job. He is the professor of rhetoric in the city of Milan. Rhetoric was, I'm going to say it, the most important study in ancient education. We don't have it as such anymore in our curriculum. It would be something akin to public speaking, social communications, media studies, all wrapped together into one science called rhetoric. If you mastered rhetoric, you could move up the ladder socially and economically, because you had a talent that was very valuable in the life of the empire. You could become a lawyer, a military leader. You could become a teacher. All the great bishops of the 5th century were rhetors. They were trained in rhetoric. You could become a governor. So you had several career paths that were open to you because you not only had studied rhetoric, every boy did, but because you had mastered it, you become really adept at it. So the teacher of rhetoric, the professor of rhetoric, was an extremely important person in the social climate of ancient Rome and the Roman Empire, and the Greeks too. Greeks invented rhetoric, not the Romans. So Augustine had this chair of rhetoric. Now, Milan at the time was the most important city in the Western Empire, Constantinople being the most important city in the Eastern Roman Empire. Now you'll say, well, what about Rome? The emperors, long before Augustine, but in his lifetime, but before he got, the emperors moved their seat from Rome to Milan. The Senate, which by then had just a kind of a rubber stamp role, like the House of Lords, the Senate remained in Rome, but the emperor and his court had moved to Milan. Why? Because of the invasion of the northern frontier of the empire by tribes that had been migrating through Eastern and Central Europe and were crossing the frontier into the Roman Empire. The Roman armies were trying to stop this invasion, migration, call it what you will. The emperors moved to Milan in order to be close to the troops, but also to keep an eye on the generals, lest they overthrow the emperor and take charge of the empire and its army themselves. All right, it's complex political reality and military reality. Now, I said Augustine had a double job. One was teaching rhetoric. The other one was the court panegyrist. What's that? The panegyrist in the Roman Empire was the speech writer and speech giver of the emperor. Emperors in their courts did not give their own speeches. The panegyrist gave the speech. And the panegyrist wrote the speech. And the speech was an act of praise of the emperor. Oh, great emperor, you have saved the nation, you have restored the greatness, blah, 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 blah. Right? Rhetoric. Mere rhetoric in that sense. But important. It was an important act of keeping together the court. The problem was, Augustine would have been good at this. The problem was the emperor was 15 years old, Valentinian II, and he really wasn't making the decisions. His mother was. The emperor was himself Catholic. His mother was not. She was an Arian Christian, which I won't go into. It's just another kind of Christian, a heretical sect. The bishop in the city was St. Ambrose, so a Catholic. And Augustine at that time was not baptized. He was not a Christian. He was not a Catholic. He belonged to yet another illegal sect called Manichaeism. So we had this religious kind of difference or struggle, tension. The Arian Christians wanted more power. The Catholics didn't want them to get that power. In Rome, back to Rome, the senators were pagans. So you had this interreligious rivalry going on. Augustine, the speaker for the emperor, who's 15, and whose mother is not a Catholic, has to navigate this mess with the speeches that he wrote. He wasn't in this position very long, and it wore him out. At the same time, he has a female partner, and they had had a child out of wedlock called Adeodatus. Augustine loved this woman, and she loved him. But Augustine is toying, not more than toying, he's actively considering conversion and baptism. Ambrose, the Catholic Bishop of Milan, who would have administered the baptism, would not baptize people who were living in arrangements, partnerships, concubinage being the ancient word for this. He would not baptize them. They were living in sin. So if Augustine wanted to get baptized, he'd have to leave his partner of 13 years. So there's that going on. At the same time, to complicate it even more, Augustine wants to form a community of men who will practice philosophy with each other, discuss great philosophical books, write great philosophical works. He had, since he was 19, a love for wisdom, which is philosophy. So, will he leave his job, his well-paid job, in order to live in a philosophical community, seeking baptism? And there's another dynamic going on. He wants to be a governor. He wants to use his career as the court panegyrist in order to win for himself a governorship. See how I said rhetoric is the way up the scala, up the ladder. So he had political ambitions, career ambitions, philosophical ambitions, religious, yearning going on. A woman he loved, a son. All of this is up in the air. He's 29 years old, trying to figure this out. He writes this: those of us who lived as friends together, this is himself, Alypius, Nebridius, sighed deeply over these experiences, and I discussed them most especially and intimately with Alypius and Nebridius. So then there were 3 gaping mouths, 3 individuals in need, gasping out their hunger to one another and looking to you, God, to give them their food in due time. So, in the midst of this, there's this search for God, search for discernment of what should I do? Not just a career decision, but a religious, a spiritual, if you will, psychological decision. What am I going to do? And what does Augustine do? He prays and he talks with Alypius and Nebridius. This is the active discernment. This is the way that goes for Augustine. There's more I could say about that, and it has a happy ending, but moving along. Self-knowledge, the 3rd pillar. Friendship, prayer, friendship, now self-knowledge. How am I doing for time? Sorry? Okay, all right, good. All right, thank you. Augustine insists that prayer and friendship act together to bring us to understand ourselves. So now we're moving into the 3rd pillar, the 3rd field, self-knowledge. And I've already said a lot about self-knowledge, because you talk about prayer, you have to talk about self-knowledge. You talk about friendship, you have to talk about self-knowledge. Now let's focus a little more on self-knowledge, and we'll see, surprise, surprise, that prayer and friendship are components of coming to know myself. I get a little bit tired of Augustinians, members of my order, who latch on to the term interiority in relation to Augustine. Interiority may be a synonym for self-knowledge, turning into yourself. And Augustine does use that language. He says in an early work of his, do not go outside of yourself, but return to within yourself, for truth resides in the inmost part of man. You were closer to me than I am to myself. You were more intimately present to me than my innermost being. Nothing is more intimate to a person than his conscience. So you see, if you take isolated texts from Augustine, isolated passages, you get this idea of Augustine as alone with the alone, sort of, I delve into it. It's almost an introspection. Now, there's an element of introspection in self-knowledge. I'm not saying that there isn't. I'm not saying that all the knowledge of myself comes from my friends, or that I got some kind of a religious insight in myself through prayer. Augustine doesn't dismiss these elements. Remember, they're all like these facets of a gem. They all work together. They're all part of the discernment activity. But introspection itself, no. That's not really Augustinian. And yet, my confreres, keep talking about interiority because they don't really read Augustine. They just kind of get bits and pieces of, oh God, this is nice, Our self-discovery is not accomplished in isolation from friends. He wants his friends to show that they love what is good in him and tell them when they disapprove of his faults. Remember that Alypius, his closest friend, criticized him over his sexual involvements, while Nebridius convinced him to abandon astrology. But whether his friends approve of him or disapprove, he knows that they do so out of genuine love for him. And because he knows this, he can open up to them about himself. So again, self-knowledge, right? Nebridius, Augustine, what are you doing with astrology? You're basically, losing yourself in this pagan worship of the stars and the gods and this, that. This is data for Augustine, right? Oh, yeah, I am. Break anybody away from any addiction, and you are basically giving them self-knowledge. It's coming from you, from that person. The guy doesn't need to go meditate. Am I an alcoholic? That might help. But it's transactional. It happens transpersonally. It happens because someone loves me. Someone is pursuing my good. And by pursuing my good, they are helping me to come closer to God, the ultimate good, the summum bonum. And Alypius, I didn't go into Augustine's sexual escapades. I could, but, there wouldn't be enough time. Now, okay, so Augustine says, it's okay for my friends to approve of me. That's nice. But if they disapprove of me, if they correct me, if they tell me about something that I don't want to hear about myself, I can accept it as long as I know they love me. So again, there has to be that bond of friendship, which is about leading the other into the love of God. Quoting Augustine, yes, let a brother love in me what you teach us to be worthy of love, and deplore in me what you teach us to be deplorable. But let it be a brother who does this. Let it be a brother who, when he approves of me, will rejoice over me, and when he disapproves, will be saddened on my account. Because whether he approves or disapproves, he still loves me. To such people, I will disclose myself. That last line, to such people, I will disclose myself. So, I'll open up. I'll talk about myself. Another, pathway to self-knowledge with those who love me, friends. So you see the connection here between self-knowledge and friendship. Tell me what you want about myself, but love me. If you don't love me, you want to criticize me, that isn't going to help me. That's what I got. It's obvious. Common sense in a sense. When he speaks to me honestly about myself, my friend can be a mirror through which I see myself. But for Augustine, both prayer and friendship lead us to listen to God's voice deep within our innermost self. So he's not dismissing this introspective dynamic. He's not saying, I never have to really take some time to examine myself because I've got my friends to do that, right? No. Or I can read the Bible and get that. No. You still need to come into contact with your conscience. Forge ahead, Augustine says, my brothers and sisters. Always examine yourselves without self-deception. In other words, try to get beyond the mask, the denial that goes on in your head. After all, there's nobody inside you before whom you need to feel ashamed or whom you need to impress. But there is someone there, the one who is pleased with humility. Examine yourself. Always be dissatisfied with what you are if you want to arrive at what you are not yet. Because whenever you are satisfied with yourself, you're stuck. Always add some more. Always keep on walking. Always forge ahead. So I mentioned humility there. Augustine mentioned humility there. And I want to say a few words about humility. Humility consists in honesty about oneself. It's not self-abnegation. It's not hating yourself. It's not belittling yourself. Honesty. For Augustine, that person is humble who is honest about his faults and willing to admit them. A humble person also recognizes that whatever good he does or evil he avoids is done through the grace of Christ and not through his own efforts alone. Humility is the basis of the Christian life. Without it, no one can know God's will. Discernment, therefore, requires humility as its starting point. Quoting Augustine, "If you should ask me what the ways of God are, I would tell you that the first is humility, the second is humility, and the third is humility. And no matter how often you keep asking me, I will say the same over and over again. Not that there are no other guidelines to follow, but if humility does not precede all that we do, our efforts are fruitless." Augustine not only preached about humility, but he also practiced it in his own life. His past life was literally an open book. He called it Confessions. In it, he courageously reveals his faults from childhood through adulthood. He does so, he tells us, so that we can learn to do the same and to find God by looking closely at our deepest anxieties, not by ignoring them. Yes, for Augustine, sin is most clearly experienced as an anxiety. This is important. We sin, we feel anxious. That's what we feel, anxiety. We commit sin whenever we offend God by failing to love him or our neighbor. Sin is what we do or fail to do. However, we experience sin as an anxiety. Quoting Augustine, "When at last I cling to you with my whole being, there will be no more anxiety or struggle for me, and my life will be filled with you. But now it is very different. I am a burden to myself. Joys over which I ought to weep do battle with sorrows that should be a matter for joy, and I know not which will be victorious. But I also see forms of grief that are evil at war in me with joys that are good, and I know not which will win the day. This is agony, Lord." Augustine writes this when he's a bishop, when he's 36 years old. He does not know to which the victory will go, he says. When we look at this passage closely, we see that it contains some startling statements. Augustine penned them while he was a bishop in Africa. He is no longer the young man who sat in the garden in Milan 10 years earlier and experienced a religious conversion. He actively cares for the spiritual needs of his people, celebrates Mass, preaches, prays, leads a monastic community, and writes important books about God. So what he says here about himself can seem hard to understand. Joys of which I ought to weep do battle with sorrows that should be a matter for joy, and I know not which will be victorious. What he is saying is that if my mind and heart were really fixed on God, many of the things I do that give me sinful pleasure would be things I regret doing. At the same time, the suffering I experience would instead be a cause for joy because it heals me. And I do not know whether, by the end of my life, the deceptive pleasures or the healing suffering will be victorious over my soul. I have become an enigma to myself. He writes this as a bishop. I have become an enigma to myself. Some interpreters of Augustine criticize him for being pessimistic about the human condition. They write about the dour Augustine, who is overly scrupulous and self-critical. But concretely speaking, what kind of painful experiences is Augustine talking about? He tells us explicitly in Book 10 of his Confessions. Now, here he confesses his sins, the sins not of his past, but that he's actively committing at the time he's writing Book 10 of the Confessions, when he is a bishop. And I'll read them serially. In my memory, sexual images survive because they were imprinted there by former habit. I struggle every day against overindulgence in eating and drinking. Every day, colors and shapes affect me, and I can never rest from them. I fight against tempting images so that I am not gripped by them. How many things craftsmen have made, clothing, footwear, and artifacts of every conceivable kind, pictures too. But notice how far these artisans have gone beyond producing what is necessary or useful for us. As for me, I still get caught up in these beautiful objects. There is the temptation to want praise and affection from others in order to make such admiration itself the cause of my joy. It leads only to a miserable life and shameful pretension. The enemy lies in wait for those of us who, because of our official positions in society, like bishops, are loved and respected by our peers. On every side, the devil uses popular approval to trap us so that we look for gratification and flattery. I enjoy being praised. I get increased satisfaction over my good qualities when they are praised by another person. But I feel deflated when I am criticized. On the other hand, I am saddened at times by the admiration I receive when qualities of mine which I do not like are praised, or even when those of my good points, which are not important, are rated more highly than they deserve. End quote. This is the kind of self-examination Augustine is talking about. He is self-critical, yes, but not in a way that crushes his spirit. These are the faults that Augustine tells us are worrying him as an adult, as a bishop. This is the personal inventory that his conscience reveals to him as he looks at himself in all humility. But having admitted all of this about himself, he surprisingly feels relief because he knows that now God is even closer to him than before. This is essential. So Augustine lists here his sins. Actually, I think they're pretty, banal. But all right, this is what he thought he was doing. Especially this love of praise. I like to be praised. I feel flattery. I'm disappointed when people don't like me or appreciate me or talk nice about me.
It's over excessive.
Sure. But what he says here is really important, and we can easily miss it. The more he comes into contact with this shadow side of himself, let's call it that, the more he comes into contact with it, the closer he feels to God. Not the more distant, the closer he feels to God. It's paradoxical. How does he explain this? If you keep your eye on your sins, then even while you look at them, God forgets them.
Thank God.
Thank God. If you keep your eye on your sins, then even while you look at them, God forgets them. I tell people this in confession. I tell the kids at school this in confession. You come, you confess your sins, and God forgets them. Not forgives, God forgets them. If only we could. All right. Augustine writes, I am needy and poor, but I am better for recognizing it and seeking your mercy until my shortcomings are made good and my imperfect self is made perfect in your peace. You have dwelt in my memory, and it is there that I find you when I remember and delight in you. These are my holy joys, and they are your gift to me. For in your mercy you look graciously upon my poverty. So not all the thoughts that come up through conscience, through memory, are thoughts of doing mistakes, of bad things. there are joys, there are successes, there are times that he felt close to God. So, and I'll close on this point, the experience of coming to know oneself through one's story involves not just difficult memories, but also deep spiritual joys. Augustine speaks a great deal about experiencing God's mercy once he acknowledges that he has sinned. But what exactly constitutes that mercy? God is merciful. God has mercy on me. God was merciful with my sins. What does that mercy consist in? What does God's mercy feel like? We realize that we are not yet the best versions of ourselves. But for Augustine, God's mercy consists in putting his arms around us and telling us, I've got you. No need to fear. No need to feel anxious anymore. I have you. I've got you.